Good evening, everyone. I thought today we'd try something a bit different, more along the literary, poetic lines of ancient culture and mysticism. Many of you will doubtless be aware of the famous Greek poets Homer and Hesiod, who mark the dawn of the Western canon in literature. One of Homer's epic poems is the Odyssey, which has endured the dissolving sands of time. Its creation is dated to be around the 8th or 7th century BCE. That brings us back to the nebulous mists of ancient Greek civilization. The stories contained within it may in fact be part of an earlier tradition, since Homer could very well have been the first to set these stories down in writing. But as we know, oral transmission of such stories may far predate their written composition. The Neoplatonous Process differentiated between three types of poetry: imitative, educational, and inspired. He believed that Plato's criticism of poets in the Republic was in reference to those poets who simply created imitative works. Proclus considered Homer to be the example of an inspired poet. In fact, in the Greek magical papyri, not to mention countless other writings across antiquity, Homer's and Hesiod's poetry have been used for incantations, for example to reduce violent tempers and even to cure physical ailments. There has always been a great reverence for these works and a suggestion of their numinous power and deeper meaning. The argument that mythological exegesis conducted by ancient commentators is simply an exercise in allegory is false and very misleading. Allegory is a literary device that was produced in the medieval period. A similar issue arises when one reads Aristotle. He believed that a good poet expressed himself not through enigmas, but through metaphor. A metaphor for Aristotle refers to a hidden meaning, but most importantly, this is a meaning that can be easily grasped by the listener or reader. As most modern literary criticism is based on the fundamentals outlined by Aristotle, this therefore would mean that we take a rather superficial view to understanding and interpreting these ancient poems, reducing their rich subtlety and complexity to literal or narrow understandings. This evening, I want to focus on an anagogical interpretation by Roger Sorter of one of the many adventures in the Odyssey, that being the encounter of Odysseus and his men with the Cyclops named Polyphemus. Odysseus and his men find themselves captured by the giant Cyclops and closed in by a rock at the entrance to his cave. He has a single bulbous eye and towers over all other men. His staff is said to be the size of the mast of a merchant ship, and his strength is more than 24 wheeled wagons. He is mildly intelligent and not completely witless. He offers some sadistic remarks about eating Odysseus last so that he can watch his men being slowly consumed. Odysseus berates him for failing to honor a guest into his home. This was a particularly important custom in the ancient world and was attached to Zeus. But Polyphemus shows no reverence for the gods, unlike the other giant tribe, the Phaeacians. The Cyclops seem to follow their own rules, ignoring the divine law. Furthermore, Polyphemus is a skilled shepherd and has many sheep, and nowhere in the story is it implied that he eats their flesh, but rather, at his meal, he cooks their milk and has plentiful wheat, barley, and cheeses that he consumes. But on this particular occasion, he saw it fit to shred and tear to pieces and digest live human beings. Polyphemus has begun to consume flesh. But the most important element to keep in mind here is that even though the Cyclops are giants, they are still human beings, although they may have a single eye and possess larger dimensions. The story has the horror of cannibalism attached to it. There is something perverse about the digesting of fellow human beings, a particular taboo. But what's important here is a pre-Socratic by the name of Empedocles, who, much like the Orphics and Pythagoreans, held to the idea of reincarnation or the transmigration of souls. Quote, "Will ye not cease from this harsh-sounding slaughter? Do you not see that you are devouring one another in the thoughtlessness of your minds?" Much like many societies in the East, there was a taboo with consuming the flesh of another animal. In fact, in many instances, plants were also considered fellow ancestors, since souls could reincarnate in vegetable and plant life. But on a practical level, where does this lead your average person? If one cannot eat plants or animals, then the only recourse is to starvation and annihilation. In ancient pre-India, the Vedic civilization developed incredibly complex systems of rituals, many of which were also used to exculpate the inherent sin of committing murder upon a sacrificial animal or another being. They even referred to themselves as the flayed ones, since the human skin was given over to the cow. And in regard to the relationship between the sacrificer and sacrificed, the animal had to consent to the ritual. Plato's cave can also contribute to our understanding of this chilling episode in the Odyssey if we understand the cave to represent the world we currently inhabit. But I'd like to leave that for a bit later and discuss the fact that the cave also represents the animalistic and brutal and violent nature of humanity and its need to satiate its hunger in the cavernous stomach, to consume in order to survive, to kill its fellow humans and to digest them and burn them over the fire. The case is not made simply for promotion of dietary restrictions like vegetarianism, because ultimately even that is not a relief from the guilt of killing and being killed in an eternal autophagy, the struggle of creature against creature. It is part and parcel of the tainted and polluted human condition. In fact, not even the dead, the spirits that roam the earthly realm and the underworld, are immune from the need for blood, as shown with Odysseus' magical rites with Circe. But there is one interesting solution to this problem that is suggested. That is the play on utis metis. It would lead us too far afield if we were to outline the details of this play on words, but if you are interested, read the article Some Symmetry and Paradox in Utis. When Odysseus tells Polyphemus that his name is Utis, this is a very sophisticated trick. Utis means nobody or no one, and metis means cunning, craftiness, the element of surprise, right timing, intelligence, alertness, and an ever-attentive awareness of the present moment. In the play of words, they hint at one another. So when Polyphemus is blinded by his captives, he cries out to his fellow Cyclops for help. And when they ask what happened, he cries out, "Friends, nobody is murdering me by craft. Force there is none." But answering him in winged words, they said, "If nobody harms you when you are left alone, illness which comes from mighty Zeus you cannot fly, but make your prayer to your father Lord Poseidon." There are two no-ones or nobodies that Odysseus becomes. The first is when he sheds the heroic values of honor and reputation and finds a refuge for his grief in passing among humankind without a name. In this no-one, he becomes anonymous and hence invisible in a very real sense to Polyphemus and the other Cyclops. But in the second sense of no one, later, when he is offered immortality by Calypso, he transcends his mortal condition. Quote, "Nothing less than this will secure his release from Polyphemus' cave, from the belly, from his own nature as a creature which kills and eats to survive." Right after they've escaped, in his hubris, Odysseus calls out his real name and is sorely punished for that boastful act by Polyphemus' father Poseidon. Later on in the poem, Odysseus learns the dangers and suffering inherent in his identification with his egoic self as Odysseus. His later disidentification dissociates himself into virtually two selves. This is most pronounced at the banquet held by Alcinous, one who realizes his guilt at the loss of his men, and the other Odysseus who starves for hunger pangs in his belly. There is a tension presented here between the animal and human side of Odysseus, the mortal and the immortal. He hates the food that he eats to ease his hunger, because it softens the pangs of guilt that to him rightfully torment him. Sorter quotes here, Here's a quote from Sorter. His hatred of his identity as Odysseus has brought about transcendence of his identity as a mortal creature. There is a suggestion that the true Odysseus is the one struck by grief and hostile to the needs of the stomach and bodily requirements. In another scene in the cave, it is important to bring up that the blinding of Polyphemus was performed by an olive pole that was heated in the ashes of the fire in order to make it hot. Because it is hot and therefore glows with the heat, it also conducts a light. It is the piercing light that destroys the eye, the physical eyesight of Polyphemus in this understanding. It is the physical senses that blind the soul from the invisible. Paradoxically, it is physical sight that actually blinds, the physical world that perceives passively as if in sleep. There's a great complementarity of imagery as Polyphemus' cave becomes a representation of Odysseus' belly that now holds him as its captive. And Polyphemus' eye is precisely Odysseus' eye. There is a blinding to both parties simultaneously. But the physical sight that is lost creates a corresponding inner sight, or insight, that is gained, particularly with regard to Odysseus' recognition of his soul's binding and enchainment to his physical animal self. Plato's cave imagery comes into play in the sense that the projections of images and shadows cast on the wall are not real, but must be overcome through the senses and by the senses in order to escape the world of blindness and perceive the world of the truly real. By whittling away at the ego and becoming no one, and by blinding ourselves from the superficial senses of our visual experience, we uncover the deeper layers that lie occulted behind the appearances. Through this, we may access that transcendent realm that lies within the immanent realm and escape the bestial and brutal cave of Polyphemus.